November 1995. At a rally in Tel Aviv, Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin salutes the huge Israeli crowd, here to mark an important step towards peace with the old Palestinian enemy. But some Israelis think this peace accord is a betrayal. That night, a Jewish fanatic strikes, shooting Rabin dead. Rabin was murdered at a dangerous time in a peace process which was agreed but incomplete.
I am very sad and very shocked for this awful and terrible crime against one of the brave leaders of Israel and the peacemakers.
Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin had shown the world that they could be partners for peace. Had the assassin's bullets also killed the hopes that that partnership had raised? Hope and despair are ever present here in one of the world's most enduring and explosive territorial conflicts. The modern conflict between Arabs and Jews began around the turn of the 20th century. Although the two sides have different faiths, religious differences are not the cause of the conflict. It's essentially a struggle over land. Palestinian Arabs say the land is theirs because they've lived there for more than 1,000 uninterrupted years. Jews insist the land is theirs because Palestine was the seat of the biblical and historical Kingdom of Israel. The movement which gave birth to the modern Jewish claim to the land of Israel is called Zionism, after one of the biblical names for Jerusalem. Its core belief is that Jews aren't just a religious or ethnic community, but a fully fledged nation. Zionists believed the only way to end centuries of persecution and discrimination was to create a Jewish state for a Jewish people, bringing together Jews from all over the world in a place they could call home. Anti-Jewish prejudice or anti-Semitism goes back many centuries. Jews in Eastern Europe were frequent victims of persecution at local and state levels. In many places they were forced to live apart in ghettos.
The Jews were a discriminated and persecuted people, particularly in the Russian Empire, where the great majority of European Jews lived at that time. And Zionism offered to the Jews in Eastern Europe a solution to the predicament in which they found themselves.
Jews were spread across the world in diaspora, communities with no nation. The father of Zionism, Theodor Herzl, declared that the movement's aim was to create a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. In the drive to escape persecution, hundreds of thousands of Jews fled Europe. Many went to America, where they formed a group which was to become a powerful lobby for Israel in the 20th century. But Palestine exerted a strong pull on Jews, and waves of immigrants arrived there in the closing decades of the 19th century. They put their need for a homeland above the claims of the people already living there.
They came as Europeans into a third world country and didn't see the natives really. And because the natives weren't resurgent as a nation, as a people, but were just locals, they didn't see them, or they tried not to see them. They also had, of course, a psychological need not to see them, because if they saw that the land was full, how could you sell the idea of Zionism to people who yet had to come?
At that time, the territory was part of the Ottoman Empire. It had controlled vast areas of the Middle East for centuries. At the outbreak of World War I, the Ottomans sided with Germany against the Allies. Britain, however, was anxious to secure the region as it was of high strategic and economic value. The British sent a senior diplomat, Sir Henry McMahon, to make a secret deal with the Arab ruler of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina to lead a revolt against their Ottoman rulers. McMahon promised that if the Arabs supported Britain in the war, the British government would support the establishment of independent Arab statehood in the region. The Arabs defeated the Ottomans, and Britain took control over much of this area during World War I. But Britain made another promise in the midst of war. The British Foreign Minister, Lord Balfour, declared his government's support for a Jewish national home in Palestine. The Balfour Declaration was the first significant announcement by a world power in favour of the Zionist project.
The fact is that the British, during the First World War, were trying to construct a coalition, trying to keep together a coalition against the Central Powers, that's to say against Germany and the Ottoman Empire and Austria-Hungary. And in order to do that, they made arrangements with a number of allies. They made arrangements with the Arabs, and they made arrangements with the Zionists. These were wartime expedients.
The Arabs and the rest of the world were presumably supposed to be fooled by the ambiguous terms of the Balfour Declaration and the mandate. It was clear to the Zionists and it was clear to the British that what was meant was ultimately Jewish domination and sovereignty over Palestine. And the Arabs, not being entirely stupid, were able to figure this out. And so their attitude towards Zionism became more and more harsh, more and more antagonistic, because they saw that these were outsiders coming to take over their country.
Britain's double-sided commitment sowed the seeds of a century of conflict. Offering support to Jews and Arabs made Palestine a twice-promised land. After World War I, Britain and France persuaded the new League of Nations, in which they were the dominant powers, to give them authority over the former Ottoman territories. These new British and French regimes were known as mandates and protectorates. Britain obtained the mandate for Palestine, plus the newly established states of Transjordan and Iraq. Britain tried to persuade the Arabs to embrace the idea of a Jewish homeland. But it was now that the incompatible promises of wartime began to cause problems. Arab insecurity wasn't helped by the promises in the Balfour Statement and in the mandate conditions of support for the creation of a Jewish homeland. More and more Jews were coming in from Europe, buying land and settling. The Arabs were convinced a Jewish homeland in Palestine was on the way.
The Jewish population of Palestine increased from approximately 17% at the end of the 20s to well over 30% in a matter of 4 or 5 years. Had that trend continued, the Palestinians saw that they would be drowned. They would become a minority within their own country in a matter of only a few years.
Adolf Hitler, the indomitable Nazi leader, is now Chancellor of Germany. Inspired by his...
The rise of Nazism in Hitler's Germany opened a new horrific chapter of anti-Semitism. Throughout the 1930s, Jews fled from Europe to settle in Palestine. Immigration quadrupled. But the Arabs resented their arrival, and the Jews soon came under attack in their new homeland.
At the Wailing Wall, refugees under British protection leave their quarters where terrorists have instituted the rule of force. British police search for arms in a country where in just over a month, nearly 40 people have been killed in the disturbances.
Because they failed to respond to Arab fears, the British came to be seen as hostile to the Arab cause, and they too began to come under attack. Arab discontent erupted into widespread civil disobedience with a general strike in 1936. As things got worse, in 1937, Britain set up a royal commission to look at the issue, headed by the Secretary of State, Lord Peel. The Peel Commission recommended that the mandate for Palestine should be ended. It called for the land to be divided into Jewish and Arab states.
The Peel Commission of Inquiry and its report was significant in the history of the conflict because the analysis was correct. There were two nations and they could not be reconciled, and the only solution was partition.
Palestinian and Arab representatives rejected this. They demanded an end to immigration and the setting up of an independent Arab state.
The New Jerusalem, built for peace, today is the center of turmoil and riot. British patrols in the city adopt the sternest methods to keep order.
In the summer of 1937, the Arab revolt that had been suspended during the deliberations of the Peel Commission reignited.
Royal Engineers purged with dynamite the area where many have met a violent death.
That revolt in turn forced the British to bring in an unprecedented concentration of forces, tens of thousands of troops, squadrons of planes. And on the eve of World War II, which everyone knew by the late 30s was coming, put Britain in an impossible situation.
Once they'd crushed the revolt, the British began to rethink the way they ran the mandate, trying to keep order in an increasingly tense environment. They were paying the price for their earlier double dealing. That rethink resulted in a dramatic change of direction from Balfour's promise to the Zionists. In 1939, a British government white paper proposed that Palestine should be one country with Arabs and Jews sharing authority. For 5 years, there'd be strict limits on Jewish immigration. Beyond that, new immigrants could come only if the Arabs agreed.
Just at the moment when the Jews most needed a state, a place to run away to, a haven for their persecuted brethren, the British closed the gates and left them stranded, in effect, in Europe, which ultimately meant that they were going to die at Nazi hands. I mean, the British didn't necessarily know this, but they knew that their Jews were being persecuted, and nonetheless they switched policy and closed Palestine to Jewish immigration.
In 1939, the British government published a white paper on Palestine, which, looking back now, could have given the Arab community virtually all it wanted, so long as it allowed continuing Jewish inward migration, but Jews would then have had to live within an Arab state of Palestine. And it was a historic error on the part of the Palestinian leadership of that time that it rejected the British white paper.
The Zionists thought Britain's position was a betrayal of Balfour's promise. Many felt the only way to oppose the white paper was with force. So now it was the turn of the Jews to rebel against British rule. Jewish underground groups defied the British restrictions on immigration by smuggling people into the country. But as Jewish unrest intensified, terrible events in Europe were changing the whole landscape. The Nazis killed 6 million Jews in pursuit of what they called their final solution of the Jewish problem. The attempted genocide horrified and shamed the international community. Britain came under intense pressure to help the Jews to relocate to Palestine.
Hitler had been murdering Jews right and left. I saw it, and I dream about it even to this day. It is my attitude that the American government couldn't stand idly by while the victims of Hitler's madness were not allowed to build new lives.
Britain leads in an 11th-hour
But the British Prime Minister Clement Attlee resisted the pressure and refused to relax the restricted immigration written into the 1939 White Paper. And those countries which now supported the Zionist project weren't ready to open their doors to the immigrants.
The United States and other countries, while cynically closing their doors to this immigration, out of anti-Semitism, out of anti-immigrant feeling, out of whatever reasons, at the same time hypocritically put pressure on the British to force the British to allow these people to enter into Palestine. It was a particularly cynical and particularly hypocritical, particularly nauseating maneuver on the part of President Truman and the American government.
In Palestine, Arabs resented that they were expected to make room for any more immigrants.
As far as the Palestinian Arabs were concerned, they were not guilty of the Holocaust, and they weren't clear at all why they should lose any part of their country in order to make up for Europe's sins.
As the British restrictions on Jewish immigration held firm, Zionist guerrillas took action.
After a bomb explosion caused by terrorists on the British headquarters at Jerusalem, one entire corner of the King David Hotel, a building of 7 stories, was razed to the ground.
The attack on the King David left more than 80 dead, British, Arab and Jewish civil servants. It was a dramatic escalation of the Zionist revolt.
Once more, the civilized world has received a rude shock at the hands of fanatics whose wanton act is contrary to the dictates of all creeds alike and imperils the best interests of the cause that it strives to promote.
With hostilities growing between Jews and Arabs and between the Zionist militias and the British Army, Britain decided it was time to relinquish its mandate and get out of Palestine. It handed the problem over to the newly formed United Nations. In 1947, after a special investigation, the UN's General Assembly recommended dividing Palestine into Jewish and Arab states, with Jerusalem under UN control.
This was seen by the Jews as a great victory. They'd been striving for over 50 years for world recognition and for world support for Zionist state. And here at last, it was embodied in a formal decision of the world community. The world was supporting the Zionist venture and was not accepting the Arab opposition to a Jewish state.
Zionist leaders broadly accepted the UN's partition plan. It wasn't everything they wanted, but it was better than nothing. But the proposal was rejected by the Palestinian Arabs and by the surrounding Arab states. Arabs were bitterly resentful. They felt Britain's interwar policy of allowing Jewish immigration had strengthened the Zionist hand.
They could never have imposed themselves on the Arabs without the medium of British bayonets. Inconceivable, without the greatest power of the age forcing the Arabs to accept these things by main force. Zionism could never have established itself successfully in Palestine in the way it did.
Fighting began between the Palestinians and Jews days after the adoption of the UN partition plan. The country slid into civil war. The fighting became increasingly vicious, with claims of atrocities on both sides. Palestinians have claimed there was a policy to push them off their lands to rid the country of its non-Jewish inhabitants.
Palestinians fled because they were expelled by Israeli forces, or about to be attacked, or had been the subject of a whispering campaign that convinced them, by Israeli agents deliberately planted, that they were about to suffer massacres and atrocities such as they had heard of occurring in other places in Palestine, such as Deir Yassin and elsewhere.
There was never any policy of mass expulsion or blanket expulsion. It was never enunciated, was never carried out. The important thing was the Israeli government's decision not to allow them to return. This was the policy decision. It understood these refugees, who were part of a people who had fought against Jewish statehood, who were trying to destroy the Jewish state, were they allowed back, they would be an act as a fifth column, and therefore couldn't be allowed back, otherwise they would destabilize the state.
The scene is near Jericho, one of the camps for Arab refugees. The story is one of destitution. For these people, as the result of the war in Palestine, have either fled or been expelled from their homes and their livelihood.
The upheaval left hundreds of thousands of Arabs without a home. For these refugees, it was al-Nakba, the catastrophe.
At every level, for the Palestinians, there was a material loss that was on a vast scale, that wasn't rectified or compensated for. Their issue was not dealt with as a political issue. There was no recognition that they had a collective identity as Palestinians, and they felt they became marginal people living off the margins of the towns and cities in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and elsewhere that they took refuge in.
Amid increasing unrest in Palestine, the British made it clear they wouldn't stay to enforce the UN's partition plan. They set May 1948 as their deadline for withdrawal.
At Haifa, the last British troops leave Palestine, and very few of them can have been sorry. As the tanks and soldiers went aboard the transports, the thought that a difficult and thankless job had been well done must have mattered much less than the prospect of going home.
As the British left Palestine, the Zionist leader David Ben-Gurion seized the initiative and declared a new state of Israel with him as Prime Minister. It was the first Jewish state for nearly 2,000 years. The very next day, a coalition of Arab states invaded Israel, claiming they sought to save Palestine from the Zionists. Egyptian planes bombed Tel Aviv. Jordan took the west bank of the River Jordan, which flows between the two countries, and went into the old city of Jerusalem. Syria attacked from the north. It looked like Ben-Gurion's new state of Israel would survive only a few days. How could 500,000 Jews withstand the onslaught of the Arab nations with their population of 40 million?
Latest camera records from Palestine show heavy damage in and around the Arab city of Jaffa as Haganah troops move up to new positions along the war-scarred roads.
In May and June, when the fighting was hardest, the outcome of this first Arab-Israeli war was in doubt. But the Israelis were battling for their very survival, and in 3 weeks of fierce resistance, they fought the Arabs to a standstill. All parties finally agreed to a ceasefire, and armistice agreements were signed. The country once known as Palestine was now divided into 3 parts, each under the separate political control of Israel, Egypt, and Jordan. Jerusalem was divided between Israel and Jordan.
They fought the invading Arab armies and essentially defeated them, pushed them back, gained some more territory at the expense of the Palestinian area which the United Nations had earmarked. But there was no injustice in this. As the Palestinians had begun a war, people who begin wars have to pay a price. This is something the Palestinians have never actually understood.
Most of the land in what is now Israel was Arab-owned before 1948. So Israel both rid itself of an Arab population that would have been approximately half the total population of the state, and acquired all of their land and all of their property.
The region seemed locked into permanent instability, war a constant threat, a threat that soon became reality. In 1952, Jamal Abdel Nasser led a coup d'etat in Egypt and overthrew the monarchist regime. For Israel, Nasser's Arab nationalism made Egypt a threat. Egypt was home to one of the world's most important transportation systems, the Suez Canal. But it was owned by Britain and France, and very few of the huge profits made in the canal ever found their way into the Egyptian economy. In 1956, Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, bringing it under his control. Enraged, Britain and France plotted to win back the waterway.
There can be no agreed settlement which leaves the canal in the unfettered control of one man or one government.
Israel colluded with Britain and France in the plan to retake Suez.
Israel jumped on the bandwagon of this war. The one thing that all three participants agreed on was that Nasser was a bad thing, and one of the aims of all three was to try and topple Nasser by defeating his army. But there was no imminent Egyptian military threat to Israel.
Israeli troops invaded Egypt and came within 10 miles of the Suez Canal. This was the pretext for the British and French to intervene. It prompted an international crisis. America condemned the attack at the United Nations. The US was furious at being kept in the dark by Britain and France and had no intention of supporting their ambitions in the area. Eventually, the UN worked out a deal with Egypt and Israel in which Israel would withdraw. So Israel withdrew, but for them the Suez crisis was a military triumph. David Ben-Gurion showed the world that Israel was here to stay. Britain and France were humiliated. They would never recover their power in the region. That power vacuum was filled by the Cold War rivals, America and the USSR.
It wasn't until 1956 that it became clear with the outcome of the Suez War that they had supplanted the British and the French, and that these were the new big boys on the block.
Behind the superpowers' interest in the territorial wrangling of the Middle East lay a shared overriding motive: oil.
The Persian Gulf, the Arabian Peninsula, and the Gulf is by far the richest energy resource in the world. It has the largest reserves, the most easily accessible. It's been understood for a long time, certainly since the Second World War, that control of the energy resources of that region is a very powerful lever of world control.
To promote their own strategic and economic interests, both powers looked for friends in the region. Relations were built on arms deals and loans as much as on ideological solidarity.
The local states in the Middle East were happy for this to happen. They imported the Cold War because they saw the possibility of playing off the superpowers against one another. President Nasser of Egypt was particularly opportunistic in trying to play off the superpowers, but as America was uncooperative and refused to supply arms, he ended up as a close ally of the Soviet Union.
Israeli radar picks up every takeoff by Arab fighters.
The US used the same tools to build a relationship with Israel.
The post-World War II period has to be seen not only in terms of the impact of the Holocaust, but also in terms of a sophisticated understanding on the part of the most acute Zionist leaders that the United States was the world power with whom they should align themselves. And this paid off.
Israel assumed the role of America's regional policeman. This and the continued influence of the Zionist lobby on successive US governments served to increase Arab hostility towards Israel.
From this Israeli frontier post, the nearest Syrian forward position is only 700 yards away. And it's on this section of the border that Israeli intelligence sources have just reported the presence of Russian military advisors.
In May 1967, the Soviet Union told Syria that Israeli forces were massing in northern Israel to attack it. It was a lie. The Kremlin was trying to challenge America's influence in the region, even at the risk of another war. but Syria believed it was under threat and in the interests of Arab unity joined forces with Egypt, much to Israel's alarm. The Egyptians then retook the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula and imposed a blockade on the Israeli port of Eilat. This amounted to a declaration of war, since the Straits of Tiran were the Israelis' only trade route to the eastern half of the world. Israel faced the prospect of war on three fronts, from Jordan in the east, from Syria in the north, and from Egypt in the south. As the crisis deepened, on the 5th of June, Israel preemptively attacked Egypt. The Israelis' first move was to take the Egyptian Air Force completely out of the picture by attacking its runways. The few planes that did get off the ground were no match for the Israeli fighters. The Egyptian Air Force was completely destroyed. In the Sinai, Egypt had 3 times as many tanks as Israel, but with no air cover, their cause was hopeless. Israel quickly took the Sinai and Gaza. Syria and Jordan joined in the war. When the battle ended, they'd lost control not just of the Golan Heights and the West Bank, but of East Jerusalem as well. The Israelis declared Jerusalem the new capital of the Jewish state.
Those Israelis who had thought that the Arab states were about to overwhelm Israel and destroy it, as was enunciated in advance by the Arab radio stations, saw it as something miraculous. Religious Israelis saw it as a sort of a divine redemption and reoccupation of areas which had been the core areas of Jewish statehood, Judea and Samaria, which had been the core of the Judean kingdoms.
The war was over in 6 days. By its conclusion, Israel's armed forces had more than quadrupled the territory their country controlled. The war also provoked another exodus of Palestinian refugees who fled to camps in the surrounding Arab states. The 1967 war established Israel as the dominant military power in the region. The Israeli victory was so quick and so complete that the Arab states were left demoralized and discredited. They had huge numbers of soldiers, but compared to the Israelis, they were poorly equipped and poorly led. The Arab failure allowed the Palestinians' own national movement, including the Palestine Liberation Organization, to emerge as a major actor.
People like Yasser Arafat started to organize rebellion and armed resistance against the newly occupying Israeli army. And so they caught people's imagination. They had demonstrated that the Palestinians could take their cause into their own hands, they could bear arms, they were no longer pitiful refugees, they were people who had dignity because they fought for their own rights and their destiny.
We know that it's not easy. But we are ready to pay the price.
The PLO was made up of political and armed groups with different ideologies. In the 1970s, under Arafat's leadership, it became more extreme and carried out a series of attacks against Israeli and other targets. But there was little international sympathy for a cause promoted by hijacking and bombing. In September 1970, President Nasser of Egypt died suddenly. Nasser's successor, Anwar Sadat, made overtures of peace to Israel. Sadat was willing to trade land for peace. He wanted the Sinai back. The Israeli government found it hard to believe their arch-enemy's offer was on the level.
They didn't understand that A, Israel's retention of the territories forever was impossible, and B, I think they suspected the Arabs of lack of real will, of lying, very simply. They didn't believe that Sadat, who now said he wanted peace, or was saying it, not publicly, but saying it through diplomatic channels, they didn't believe he was sincere.
When this overture was ignored by Israel and the US, Egypt and Syria decided to act to break the stalemate. In 1973, they launched major offensives against Israel on the Jewish festival of Yom Kippur. The Egyptians drove the Israelis from the Suez Canal.
The 73 war, the crossing of the Suez Canal, the taking of Israeli prisoners, was a unique moment in both the history of the Arabs, of Egypt in particular, and also, of course, for the Israelis. I've met Egyptians who said, I couldn't believe it. I turned on the television, and there were Israeli prisoners. They could be taken prisoner too. And there's no doubt that militarily, the crossing of the Suez Canal in 73, and the enormous military preparations and the secrecy behind the operation were a remarkable military victory for a people, the Arabs, who were famed for losing wars.
It was pretty well taken for granted in both Israel and the United States that the Arabs weren't to be taken seriously. You didn't have to worry about them. Egypt was regarded as a kind of a basket case. That was a great mistake. In Israel, it's greatly regretted. It almost led to their destruction.
But the Israelis quickly regrouped and counterattacked. They routed the Egyptians in the Sinai Desert and turned back the Syrians in the north. It was another victory for Israel, but the war left it even more dependent on the US for military, economic and diplomatic support. The prospects for peace seemed further away than ever. In 1977, Menachem Begin came to power in Israel. He had a hard-line view on retaining the territories his country had occupied.
What occupied territories? If you mean Judea, Samaria and the Gaza Strip, they are liberated territories. They are part, an integral part of the land of Israel.
Frustrated by this tough approach and anxious to regain lost territory, the Egyptian President Anwar Sadat made a bold leap.
The Egyptian economy was suffering in the 1970s. Sadat felt that he had to open up to the West in order to receive new forms of investment, of trade and aid and so on. And that he couldn't really tap into this unless he made peace with Israel. He had to finish the war situation and the drain on the economy.
In November 1977, Sadat stunned the world by becoming the first Arab leader to visit Israel and address its parliament in Jerusalem.
ولقد جئت إليكم اليوم على قدمين ثابتتين.
Sadat's overture for peace did the trick. By 1978, a new peace process was being brokered with US assistance in the shape of President Jimmy Carter. At Camp David, Israel and Egypt worked out two agreements, a framework for peace between them and a general framework for resolving the Middle East conflict, in particular the Palestinian issue. Egypt became the first Arab state to recognize Israel's right to exist. In return, Israel gave the Sinai back to Egypt. But there was little progress on the wider issues. Determined to stamp its claim to all of Palestine, Israel had been building strongly fortified towns and communities known as settlements, where Jewish families were encouraged to make their home. Despite promises made at Camp David, Israel pursued its settlement policy. The cold peace with Israel that Anwar Sadat negotiated lasts to this day. But the Arab people and their leaders did not forgive Sadat. He paid a high price for making peace with the enemy. In 1981, he was assassinated by the Egyptian Islamic Jihad group. A year later, the region was plunged into conflict again when Israel pursued the PLO, who'd set up base in Lebanon. The Israelis invaded, claiming they wanted to wipe out the Palestinian guerrillas who were attacking Israel.
Militant Palestinian terror organizations use this area in order to invade, in order to sabotage, in order to implement terrorism on the State of Israel. And therefore the invasion was a necessity. I thought, and many Israelis thought, that it was a necessity to go in, to destroy all the infrastructure of terrorism, and then to go back to pull out our forces.
The government of the right-wing Menachem Begin at the time in 1982 feared above all not the military threat posed by the PLO, because there had been a ceasefire in fact on the border, but the political threat that the PLO was now becoming a respectable negotiating partner and he would have to sit down and negotiate and therefore give up the occupied territories and accept Palestinian statehood. And this he was unwilling to do, and that is why, fundamentally why, the Israeli government of that day invaded Lebanon and caused the deaths, obviously, of many thousand people and expelled the PLO.
Ariel Sharon said that there would be limits to this invasion. It would only go a few kilometers up the coast and stop. But as we now know from Sharon himself and others, the intention was to surround the PLO in Beirut and capture them and kill Arafat. Well, they did surround Beirut. They went all the way. And it turned into a catastrophe for everybody.
The catastrophe was the massacre of hundreds of Palestinians in the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps near Beirut. The killers were Israel's Lebanese allies, the Christian Phalangists.
Ariel Sharon was fixated at the idea there were terrorists, quote unquote, in the camp. And in fact, the Palestinians who were slaughtered there were all civilians. And this massacre stained the reputation of Israel for years to come. It led inevitably to an inquiry by the Israelis themselves, by 1 million Israelis protesting in the streets of Tel Aviv. That didn't take the shame away from the state of Israel, but at least it showed the dignity of many Israelis who believed that their country should not be involved in such horrors.
אני מבקש לך לא לעזור לי, סגן השר גרופר, לא לעזור לי.
לא באתי להסביר את הטרגדיה הנוראה הזאת, כי היא שייכת לעולם של יצרים אפלים, לא שלנו, אלא של אלה שביצעו את מעשה הטבח.
An Israeli inquiry condemned Ariel Sharon. He was forced to resign as defense minister. Since the 1967 war, the West Bank and Gaza Strip have been occupied by Israel despite repeated UN resolutions requiring it to withdraw. The occupation has been the focus of Palestinian protest and unrest. Israel established a military and civil administration to govern and control most aspects of Palestinian life.
They have all the important aspects in terms of controlling our resources, our land, actually stealing our land, controlling our lives, actually killing people daily, controlling our freedom, actually imposing a state of siege, and ongoing abductions and imprisonments. And so it's one of the most brutal, if not the most brutal and cruel system of control and oppression and manipulation there is.
The Israelis insist they have to impose restrictions.
We're talking in terms of 36 years of occupation, my friend. 36 years of occupation. It's not that easy. And you know that you have to feed the kids, to allow the people go to the hospitals, to live, to work, to go to schools, to live. But on the other hand, you know that in every corner you are expected some ambush to kill you, to destroy you.
As the occupation continued, so did Palestinian militant attacks on Jews in Israel and abroad. Palestinian resentment at what they see as Israeli repression in the West Bank and Gaza is heightened by their anger against the policy of settlement building. Palestinians regard the hundreds of thousands of settlers who live under tight Israeli military protection as intruders who have stolen their land. According to the international community in Gaza and here on the West Bank, Israel is violating the law on the military occupation of foreign territory. But Israel insists it's not technically occupying these areas since they've never been part of the sovereign territory of any state. By 1987, tension in the territories was building to boiling point. Palestinians lived with the fear of losing their land and being forced to move to other countries, and with the daily miseries of occupation. These pressures led to the first Intifada, or mass uprising.
It was a turning point because at that point Israel met its first real challenge in terms of the human spirit and the human will to endure and to defy oppression.
The goal of the Intifada was to end that occupation and achieve independence from Israel.
It gave the Palestinians a feeling that they are able to do it, and they have the power, and their weakness is their strength. And of course, it gave the Israelis a view that it will be impossible to continue to occupy the territory without any permanent solution.
The Palestinians refused to pay taxes and staged strikes and massive street demonstrations. But there were acts of violence as well, and allegations that the Israelis had instructions to use brutal punishments. The PLO leadership in exile watched the Intifada with alarm. They were in danger of losing their position as a leading player in Palestinian resistance. Arafat rose to the challenge. He moved the PLO to support a two-state solution, a state for Israel and a state for Palestine.
While the Intifada escalates, I declare we are ready. We are willing to negotiate peace.
He went on to tell the world at the United Nations that the PLO renounced the use of violence.
We totally and absolutely renounce all forms of terrorism.
For the US, this was a turning point, and it began dialogue with the PLO. But as far as Israel was concerned, the PLO were still terrorists, and there'd be no negotiation.
Believing the Palestinians is much easier for the Americans and for the Europeans because they don't have to pay a price if they're wrong about Palestinian intentions. The Israelis, if they believe Palestinian intentions and if they turn out to be evil, will pay a terrible price. So the Israelis have to be a little more cautious than the Americans.
With its changed view of the PLO, America began a process in Madrid to try to bring the two sides together.
And while we will continue to do everything possible to help the parties overcome obstacles, peace must come from within.
The initiative failed to achieve a breakthrough. The election in 1992 of Yitzhak Rabin on a pro-peace platform created a new opportunity. As the Madrid process disintegrated, Rabin and Arafat gave the green light for a secret forum of talks in the Norwegian capital Oslo.
Oslo was the breakthrough. We had to talk to the PLO, because the PLO, in a way like the IRA and like many other organizations, they were the most important organizations on the other side, whether we liked it or not, and we didn't. And by trying to bypass them and talking to artificial leadership, we always fail.
Despite these difficulties, the two sides made unprecedented progress. And by September 1993, they'd made a deal.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Arafat, Chairman of the Executive Council of the Palestine Liberation Organization, His Excellency Yitzhak Rabin, Prime Minister of Israel, the President of the United States.
The Declaration of Principles signed on the White House lawn was sealed with a historic handshake.
We who have fought against you, the Palestinians, we say to you today, in a loud and a clear voice, enough of blood and tears. Enough!
The Declaration of Principles brought the First Intifada to an end. It was based on mutual recognition by Israel and the PLO, and it offered the Palestinians a prospect of peace and statehood. It established that Israel would relax its military presence in the Gaza Strip and Jericho in the West Bank, with further withdrawals from Palestinian areas over 5 years. In that period, negotiations were supposed to lead to a final settlement of the conflict. From the very start, there were opponents on both sides who rejected the Oslo deal. On the Palestinian side, a coalition including Islamic groups emerged, unhappy that the PLO was giving up its demand for a state taking in all of Palestine. Israeli right-wingers were furious at what they saw as the surrender of Jewish land. There was violence on both sides. Palestinian militants killed dozens of Israelis in suicide bombings. Israeli extremists also carried out acts of violence. The violence created a delay which allowed the internal flaws in the process to emerge.
Both sides were committed, in fact, to achieving a deal, and both sides more or less agreed on what the final outline would be, more or less. But what they were determined to do was to maximize their bargaining advantage, and they weren't going to give anything away for free in advance. That was the fatal flaw of Oslo, which left everything in a way, created all the incentives for being miserly at the beginning, giving away as little as possible, twisting each other's arm in order to maximize the bargaining position of one's own side at the end, when the real negotiations came, finally to start over Jerusalem, refugees, borders, settlements, etc.
The result was that the final settlement negotiations never really got off the ground. Oslo was the story of two men. Yasser Arafat returned in triumph to the streets of Gaza and became the head of the new Palestinian Authority. Yitzhak Rabin was welcomed as a hero by some sections of the Israeli public, but there was fierce opposition in other quarters. In 1995, Prime Minister Rabin was assassinated by a Jewish extremist.
I believe that the assassination of Rabin was the most important event of the last years, which created a very different mood in Israel and in Palestine, and made it much more difficult to achieve peace. Rabin was the personification of the Oslo process. And the symbol, the icon, was removed. And if at the beginning, after the assassination, there was a huge majority for peace, it faded away.
Rabin's assassination left a vacuum that was filled by the extremists on both sides. Their violence made the search for peace all but impossible.
It's impossible. This moment it will be the end, must be the end of this bloody peace process.
The election in February 1999 of the Labour Party's Ehud Barak brought a new impetus. He came to office on the dual pledge of making peace with the Palestinians and withdrawing from Lebanon. In May 2000, after 18 years of occupation, Barak withdrew Israeli troops from Lebanon. The final status negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians, which were to have started in 1996, finally began in earnest in the year 2000, once again sponsored by the White House.
Both leaders feel the weight of history, but both, I believe, recognize this as a moment in history which they can seize.
But major differences soon emerged in what each side was prepared to offer, and the talks broke down. The stumbling blocks, as always, the dispute over who ruled Jerusalem, home to the holiest sites of both Jews and Muslims. The legality of Israeli settlements in the Palestinian territories, and the right of return of Palestinian refugees. Later that year, Ariel Sharon, the man shamed over the Sabra and Shatila massacres and now the opposition leader, made a controversial visit to the most revered Muslim shrine in Jerusalem's Old City.
I came here with a message of peace. I believe that we can live together with the Palestinians.
Palestinians considered his visit sacrilege, and there was violent confrontation. Israeli troops opened fire, killing a number of protesters. Palestinians across the territories erupted in fury at the killings. This was the trigger for the Second Intifada, another cycle of violence which has yet to run its course. Decades of conflict and numerous peace plans have failed to resolve the anger and fear that stalk this ancient place. Jews and Arabs, Israelis and Palestinians have the same dream, a secure and peaceful future. But they've not been able to find the key to the door that leads to that promised land.